Hello and welcome to the Dolby Institute podcast. This is a show about how artists use technology to tell their stories, and I'm your host, Glenn Kaiser. If you're curious to know more about the Dolby Institute, head on over to dolbyinstitute.com. There you will find information about all of our programs. You can access the entire library of episodes of this podcast, and you can sign up for our mailing list. Today, we're putting the spotlight on a new film, Nanny, written and directed by Nikyatu Jusu. The film premiered at the Sundance Film Festival this past January and made history as the first horror film to take the U.S. Grand Jury Prize for drama. Nanny tells the story of a young domestic worker named Aisha, who is struggling to bring her son to New York City from Senegal. As the story progresses, it becomes an intriguing blend of West African folklore and horror with a soundtrack that grips the audience and heightens the tension of the story. The film is streaming right now on the Prime Video platform, and I encourage you to watch it. Nanny is also the recipient of the 2022 Dolby Institute Fellowship, which is a program that we created with Sundance to give a direct post-production grant to an independent, low-budget film which is using sound and image in a unique and creative way to tell its story. The grant supports the filmmaker in finishing the film using Dolby Vision and Dolby Atmos. And I'm sure if you've seen Nanny, you understand why we fell in love with this movie and why we were excited to support Nikyatu and her vision in bringing this movie to the screen. Last week, my colleague and producer of this podcast, Amanda Schneider, got to sit down with Nikyatu and her collaborators, supervising sound editor Dave Flynch and re-recording mixer and longtime friend of this podcast, Skip Lievsay, to talk about the film. This was a post-screening conversation in front of a live audience at the Artist Academy, a wonderful program of the New York Film Festival and our friends at Film at Lincoln Center. Since it was a conversation for a crowd of young filmmakers, our panel got very candid about their creative process. Amanda started off the conversation by asking Nikyatu why she chose the genre of horror to tell Aisha's story.
I love horror's ability to elevated horror specifically, because I know a lot of people are like, this is not horror, traditional horror. And that's fine, because nothing about me is traditional. So the horror films that I have reverence for, like A Tale of Two Sisters, The Babadook, pieces that are a slow burn, rising tension, utilizing soundscape as a character, utilizing picture as a character. I find that in international horror, you get a little more leeway to not be so paint by the numbers in terms of jump scare every 10 minutes or jump scare 5 minutes in. I'm interested in the ways that I'm centering quote unquote non-traditional protagonists within a genre that people are not used to seeing, specifically Black women protagonists within the horror realm. And I love when horror is a conduit for universal themes of grief, of regret, of depression, of loneliness, of alienation. So for those reasons, and stylistically, you just get to play more with the tools, particularly soundscape.
Well, the sound design does do a remarkable job to establish and build the tension through the story. And there are definitely a lot of moments, specific moments in the track that I would love for you all to discuss. A few that come to mind are Aisha on the pier as she sees the figure of the mermaid in the water, Aisha seeing the phantom Lamine in the park, the underwater sequence in the pool right before Aisha is visited by Mami Wata. Did I say it right this time?
Yes, you did.
Excellent.
It's better.
Any of these, all of these.
Yeah, the pier. I'll lead you. I know you guys, it's been a while. Well, Dave, you just saw it. So, but the pier particularly, like when she first sees Mami Wata, I think that the goal was to have her, I don't want to call it a dream world or a psychosis because she sees what she sees and she's seeing something very tangible. But we wanted that world to collide with the realistic world, the naturalistic world. So having that sound bridge of the child crying breaks her out of this trance. And I always love to have collisions of silence and whimsy with naturalistic sounds that originate in the world.
I think that that particular moment, we had the opportunity to really kind of establish that character. It's one of the first times we were experiencing her, so really establishing what her sound is going to be moving forward throughout the film. So there are opportunities to sort of segment those two characters, the Mamiwata character and the Anansi character. And this is one of those moments, again, where we sort of like tried to sort of carve out moving forward what that story is going to sound like throughout the film. And I think that throughout the notes that we'd gotten from Nikyatu over the course of making a film, one of the things that she wanted was to make sure that there was a clear distinction between those characters. And I think that was established also with music, along with the sound design, the choices that we made. So as you go through that, and in each of those moments that you talked about, there's this distinct decision to sort of create water elements as opposed to other elements for the Anansi character. Mm-hmm. And I think we sort of took the entire soundscape on that path and try to stay consistent with that. And again, with music too, we tried to do the same thing we established with music.
Agree.
I really like the kind of middle ground, like Middle Earth, where you have it's really in some places it feels almost like a documentary, and then in other places it's quite abstract, really abstract, especially with regard to sound and music, and the bridge is crucial, and that's what makes it kind of believable, actually. Yeah. And it heightens the context is so heightened that when the sort of abstract events arrive, the audience is already primed. The audience already you're kind of letting them grab onto it. The way music traditionally does it, where oftentimes we have a symphonic score and it's loud or bombastic or quiet and subtle, and it helps the audience know whether they're supposed to cry or laugh. And those are really key things for the score. And here we have these really kind of Middle Earth sounds that are bridging between the reality world and the dreamscape, I guess it would be.
Yeah.
I don't want to say nightmare because it isn't a nightmare.
Supernatural.
Yeah.
The supernatural realm. I love hearing sound people talk about sound because I get new adjectives to utilize and specifically for sound because it's a language. Like when you engage, I find that my learning curve in the post-production process for sound is me listening to sound people talk about sound. Like, do you want a sound that feels full, or do you want, like, just utilizing that language to really convey what you need as a filmmaker is one of my favorite parts of collaborating with sound people. Bombastic, I would never describe. I'm gonna start doing that.
Music. That's a music term.
Well, speaking of music, we were also just talking about that. Could you talk a little bit more about the music of the film?
Yeah, so the music is something that came into the process early for me. I write to a playlist when I'm writing projects. I outline, I conceive of ideas, I create a playlist as I start a project. Spotify, I literally have a Nanny playlist that Blumhouse just shared because they're one of our distributors, and I think it was really smart of them to try to give the audience an idea of the soundscape that I was thinking about in the conceptual stage.
Do you have that on the set?
You know what? I had a couple of songs, especially for the intimacy. I did. I had some of the songs that spoke to the sensuality and the longing between Malik and Aisha on set. But I wanted to use artists who were quirky, who were eclectic, who had these sounds that were hard to pin down. So Teneriel is an artist who's up and coming, who's amazing, and she just, her breathlessness, like the staccato breathlessness and her humming and her moaning, like that's throughout the film because her soundscape represents Aisha's void and Aisha's breathlessness and her inability to breathe. She's being crushed by this system, by this what she's navigating. So I wanted to reflect that feeling of suffocation in the soundscape.
I thought it was a great collaboration between Bartek and
Yes,
Tenariel. I
yes.
thought that when we initially talked about that idea, I wasn't sure what that was going to sound like, but once I heard it, I thought it was amazing. The two of them collaborating for the score did a really powerful job in terms of the interpretation of that.
No, I'm glad you brought up Bartek. So Tenariel is someone who is a rising artist, a musician, and I knew I wanted to bring her on to do her first score for a film. Well, she kind of pitched herself a little bit, which I found ambitious and I loved it. But sometimes when you're ushering someone new into something that they don't have a resume for, you have to pair them with someone a little more seasoned. So she collaborated with this Polish, what would you call it, composer, named Bartek. They look like an unlikely duo, but they really work together really well.
Did you have temp score during your edit?
I did. And you know what?
Don't say it was better.
No, I wasn't gonna say that. Okay. I had an editor, the main editor, who had completely different taste from me, and so that was tricky to navigate. I knew I was gonna have somewhat of a fight in the edit because I understand editing and I have a lot of reverence for editing, but he literally has opposite taste from me. And so some of the sounds that he would use, even temp, I would be like, I would struggle to say it nicely because we were just on two opposite ends of the spectrum stylistically. But in that regard, it's so important to have that temp stuff to use as a reference for someone who doesn't get it organically.
Did that guide you in your battle with the editor?
Did
you got to the right place, or did you just agree to disagree?
Skip, I think we got to the right place.
We did, yeah.
Yeah.
I'm just talking about you and the editor.
I hurt his feelings a few times, but this is my baby, so.
Had to be real with that one.
Yeah,
I think the first time we saw the film, there was a temp track for the music, as well as there was no VFX. I think when we saw it, first time
the
around.
VFX was embarrassing. It's like showing somebody, showing somebody your bikini body before you start the process of getting to your bikini body. There was a lot of temp VFX in there too.
Well, I bring it up only to say that we were so struck by the film at that point, and it didn't have a lot of the elements, that were part of the finishing process of the film. So
you saw the potential.
Yeah, absolutely. And in rewatching the film, something that really struck me was kind of the contrast of the sonic environments. There's a very stark contrast between Aisha and where she lives and the community that she lives within and her friends and her life there. And then Amy and Adam and Rose's place is, downtown, kind of loft-like, very cold, very quiet in some ways, kind of eerily quiet. And I'd love for you guys to talk a little bit more about that.
Well, I think the idea that I had was that we wanted to establish the difference, obviously, in class and also environment. So obviously, well, not obviously, Aisha lives in Harlem. Amy and Adam live downtown in this fancy loft. They're affluent. Aisha is not. And I wanted to kind of take us on that path in terms of establish those two surroundings, but at a certain point they kind of converge. Once the chaos starts between the two characters. Now they're both struggling with something, obviously, and then they come to a confluence at a certain point, and then the sound starts to evolve where they are essentially sounding very similar in a way. So the idea that I had, and Nikyatu and I had talked about this, that there was going to be a lot more activity on Aisha's side than there would be on Amy's side. Obviously, we do have to establish that they're in the city at some place, so you do hear some of those elements, but it is also very quiet in there. But also, there are a lot of big moments in terms of sound design. So if we're constantly bombarding you with sound after sound after sound, once we get to those moments, you're sort of expecting it to a certain extent, or maybe not expecting. At least there's no space for it.
Yeah.
So I think. And Skip also pulled back a lot of those elements as well in the mix. I don't know if that was his interpretation.
I'll take the blame for that.
But there's a fantastic tension, even though you have two different stories. They both have a tension. They both have sort of lurking danger on both of the. Even though they're class-wise, they're quite far apart. The tension is there equally. I felt in the film, the tension of the son, of course, and then the tension of the daughter and the relationship with the other couple. It's really, it's interesting how that both you carried tension on both sides throughout the whole thing. You kind of crashed them together at one point.
We talked a lot about character arc for the soundscape too. And, I don't think a lot of filmmakers in the American context particularly don't really think about, let me not say that because I don't know every single filmmaker in America, but there is a tendency to neglect sound in the conception stage. And so if you think about your soundscape as a character, then you can have an arc for that soundscape so that the audience doesn't become numb, as Skip and Dave are alluding to, with a relentless soundscape that is not ebbing and flowing.
Yeah, there's a lot of tension and release throughout the film, both in the big moments and also, throughout the film. But one of the things that you had mentioned in our meetings was this idea, which I never really thought about. After reading the script, I started to develop thoughts about what that world might sound like in terms of the design. And might have been this tendency to think that there's maybe this Africa influenced sound. And you mentioned this idea that you didn't want to present that Africa is this scary place in terms of the sound.
Yeah.
So I in my conversation with Paul, the sound designer, we started to talk about what else can we do to really kind of develop these ideas without alluding to the fact that this person is from Africa, without using those influences. These characters are rooted in African folklore without using those specific elements to tell the story. So that was an important note for me.
Yeah. Thank you for reminding me of that. That was important.
Awesome. Well, question for Dave and Skip. Got to get a little bit of Dolby Atmos in
Please,
here.
because I love hearing them talk.
So just wanted to ask how you felt Dolby Atmos was unlocking possibilities to highlight Aisha's mental state. I mean, it's
branding.
Exactly. We got to get a little bit of it in here. I mean, Skip, Dave, you both worked in the Atmos format, so I'd love to hear a little bit more about that.
Well, basically, once we started working with Atmos, and for me that was in 2012 on Gravity, it's just hard to work in any other format because it's a very high fidelity format, and the sound everywhere in the room, the speakers have a potential to play a very high fidelity sound at great volume, not just on the front and behind the screen as it had been to that point. And even with 7.1 and 5.1 digital, the surround channels were limited because they're smaller. And Dolby Atmos comes along and solves that problem by adding bass support to all the speakers in the room. So you can actually play a sound pretty convincingly anywhere in the room, and it sounds basically the same. And we tried that experiment on a lot of movies I worked on, where you move a sound around the room, and before Atmos, it would be pretty thin and kind of puny when you're in the surround speakers, as there were only surround speakers in those days. Now we have surround speakers and speakers in the ceiling, and they're full frequency, so you can have a sound playing in the front and you can pan it to the back and it sounds pretty much the same. And that's a really big advancement just in terms of fidelity. So you have basically a huge envelope around the audience where you can play sounds or music or dialogue, and it sounds pretty much, it's not forced. It sounds pretty even everywhere in the room. So you bump up against a historical issue in movies and sound where you didn't want to have, if you tried to play sounds off of the screen, some people in the room would say, hey, that's distracting. You can't have that. It's got to stay up on the screen. And many filmmakers, like when I started working in film, they would say it had to be in the center. It could only be there. Anything important. And if it wasn't playing in the center, then it loses importance and to the audience in the story. So the idea of having anything important play anywhere else in the room was pretty much taboo. It was nearly forbidden. And thanks to Dolby, and particularly to Atmos, you personally.
Yes, me personally. Thanks, Skip. Appreciate that. Yeah.
You did. And now we have the opportunity to play sound everywhere. And so it's not so much that's special on its own, but it's special because the limitations are gone. And the filmmakers, and in particular the studios, are starting to agree and allow a gigantic room-sized version of a soundtrack, not just the one speaker behind the screen here.
Yeah. So it was always my intention to mix in Atmos, and because we were cutting in an Atmos environment to begin with, but once we found out about this Dolby grant, it allowed us to sort of mix on a bigger stage, and obviously get someone like Skip to work on this film as well. So we definitely were pleased with that situation. But the advancements, as Skip mentioned, really lends itself to a film like this, which has such a large amount of sound design areas. There's probably a good 10 places that we have some moments that, particularly the water scene when Aisha's in the bed, there's a lot of things that's coming from the ceiling. There's a lot of things that's moving around. There's a lot of opportunity to move sound around with Atmos. So this film really takes advantage of that.
Excellent. Was there a favorite moment sonically in the film for any of you?
That's a good question. I want to hear what the...
I like the big run up to the bathtub and the knife and all that stuff. I thought that was a really fun, dynamic and unexpectedly bold situation in every way.
Yeah.
And I really liked, one thing about Atmos is it kind of gets rid of the edges, right? So instead of having a side to side, you really have a pretty big envelope that you're in the middle of. And that scene in particular, we tried to push that out that way. So you would feel like you're being sucked into that room a little bit, into the action.
Yeah.
Well, for me, it's the restaurant scene where Malik says, "Let me grab my purse." That is my favorite line in the entire film.
That was improv. I had to actually reel Sinqua back from as much. I love improv, but sometimes you gotta.
That line cracks me up every time. But in all honesty, there are a lot of moments in here, and yes, that definitely that's a key moment in the film where she's coming down the hallway and she runs into the bathroom and that whole scene happens. It is, you don't know exactly what's going to happen there. And the way that it's written and combined with the sound and the design and the music there, it really heightens the experience. So I really enjoy that moment as well.
I love that sequence too. When Paul and Dave sent me the quick pops, so like when Aisha's pulled under, when she first encounters Mami Wata in person in the pool, and we get those quick pops of her past and her future. They're different children. I love the dissonant sounds, like the really non-traditional sounds that you would think you would hear with that type of a sequence. And I remember Arrival being a reference for some of this stuff. I think Arrival, don't laugh at me. Did you like Arrival or you hated it?
I liked
this
it
is being recorded.
To a great degree. I like the movie more than I like the story.
Okay. Well, so the quick pops in Arrival, I think, were the memory shards is what I call them. And I love navigating. I think in my work, I'm constantly trying to figure out how to straddle the past, present, and future simultaneously. It's hard to convey. It sounds really abstract. And some people are like, what the F did I just watch? But in my brain, it makes sense. So I think I love that scathing, like scratchy. How would you describe it? Those quick pops. It was like grating a little bit. Yeah, and I enjoyed that.
You had sent a note in reference to that spider at one point, and there was that sort of scratchy, dissonant sound. So we took that as a note and tried to build it into the soundscape as well. So it is quite dissonant, yeah.
It is. It's interesting. And we used, both of you are reminding me that we used marine animal sounds for Mami Wata, but we didn't want it to be so literal like dolphins, you know? So I think that nature is one of the greatest references for fantasy, for VFX, whether it's creature creation or soundscape. Like, how do these creatures sound? You can really pull from nature. I don't know if anyone has heard a gaggle of like hyenas in the deep of the night. It's not just laughter. It sounds like souls being unearthed from their tombs, you know? So if you really listen to different types of animals, the soundscape exists already in nature. You just have to pay attention to what kind of creature you're creating.
Yeah, there were a lot of different animals, and particularly in that scene where Aisha is sort of being inundated with the water and her face is covered. There's like polar bears and all sorts of other things that's subtext in that edit as well. So there are a lot of layers there.
All right. Well, then we'll wrap it up. Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you so much to Nikyatu, Dave, and Skip for this great conversation, and to Amanda for hosting. And special thanks to our friends at Prime Video and Film at Lincoln Center for putting the conversation together for us. As I mentioned up top, you can find the Prime Video link to watch Nanny in our show notes. We have been so fortunate to have had so many top artists on our show this past year. This is our final episode of 2022. So from everyone here at the Dolby Institute, happy holidays. We've got a lot of great episodes planned for the new year, and we look forward to seeing you then. But before you go, please make sure you're subscribed to us, the Dolby Institute podcast. You can find links to our show on all the major podcasting platforms in our show notes, or you can simply search for Dolby wherever you get your podcasts. Until next time, thanks again for joining us. This has been the Dolby Institute podcast. I'm your host, Glenn Kaiser. Our producer and editor is Michael Coleman. Our executive producers are Amanda Schneider and Jack Ferry, with production support by Taylor Hines. And our production coordinator is Sunny Chen. Thanks again for listening.